I, Olivia 36F, have always had a complicated relationship with my mom 62F. It wasn't the kind of relationship you could easily describe as bad because, on the surface, everything seemed fine. She would smile, host family events, and make sure everyone was comfortable. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. My mom had this way of making me feel like nothing I did was ever good enough. She could turn any moment, no matter how small, into a lesson on how I was falling short. Growing up, I never realized how much of her behavior was toxic. I just thought that was normal. I'm the oldest of three. My siblings 35F and 33M seemed to have a better relationship with her, or at least they knew how to handle her better than I ever could. From the time I was a kid, she made it clear that I was expected to meet certain standards. My mom would compare me to my sister, who was always more outgoing, and my brother, who excelled in sports. If I brought home good grades, she'd brush it off like it wasn't a big deal. If I won an award, she'd ask why I didn't aim higher. Over time, I started to believe that nothing I did was enough. This went on for years. I thought I was managing okay, even after I got married to my husband, Matt 38M, who always noticed how tense I got after seeing my mom. He would encourage me to set boundaries, but I wasn't ready to lose the connection to my family. Every family event felt like a performance. I had to put on this smile, pretending everything was fine, while quietly bracing myself for the inevitable moment when my mom would criticize me, my job, my clothes, my parenting, something. The last family gathering was the breaking point. It was a casual dinner at her house, with all the usual suspects, my siblings, their kids, my husband, and our two children 8F and 6M. I tried to keep my distance from her, keeping the conversation light and neutral, but she just couldn't help herself. Out of nowhere, she made a remark about my parenting. She commented that I wasn't disciplining my daughter the right way, saying that if I didn't get control now, I would regret it later. I tried to laugh it off, pretending like it didn't bother me, but inside it hit a nerve. The rest of the night was a blur after that. I just remember keeping my head down, avoiding her as much as I could. Later that evening, when most of the guests had left, she pulled me aside for a private chat. I already knew where this was going, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. She told me, in the coldest way possible, that I was failing as a mother. She went on to say that maybe my kids would be better off without me. I don't remember the exact words after that, because something inside me just broke. I left her house without saying goodbye. The next day, I talked to Matt about everything. He's always been supportive, encouraging me to prioritize my mental health, but this time he didn't need to say much. I already knew what I had to do. I'd been seeing a therapist for the past year, and she'd helped me recognize the toxic patterns in my relationship with my mom. She had even suggested the idea of going no contact a few months back, but I wasn't ready at the time. This time was different. I sat down and wrote a letter to my mom, explaining my reasons for going no contact. I laid out everything, the years of criticism, the emotional manipulation, and how it was affecting me, my marriage, and my kids. I told her that, for my own sanity, I needed space, and that I wouldn't be speaking to her for the foreseeable future. I sent the letter. And that's when the real backlash started. Within days, my phone blew up with messages from my siblings. My sister, always the peacemaker, sent long texts about how I was overreacting and how mom didn't mean it that way. My brother's messages were more direct. He told me I was being selfish, that I was hurting the whole family. They couldn't understand why I would make such a drastic decision. To them, our mom was this perfect matriarch who had always done her best for us. They couldn't see the emotional abuse because they had learned to navigate it in their own ways. The guilt was overwhelming. I knew I had made the right decision for my mental health, but it didn't stop the constant doubt. I couldn't stop thinking about whether I was being too harsh, especially when my kids started asking why we weren't going to grandma's house anymore. I tried to explain it in a way they could understand without giving them too much detail, but the questions kept coming. My mom didn't contact me directly after the letter. Instead, she sent a message through my sister, saying that I was destroying the family. It didn't end there. My aunts, uncles, and even cousins started reaching out, taking sides. Most of them believed my mom's version of the story, that I had cut her off for no good reason. I started feeling more isolated with each passing day, wondering if maybe I was the problem. I knew deep down that wasn't true, but the pressure to make peace was unbearable. Despite everything, Matt stood by me. My therapist reminded me that setting boundaries with toxic people isn't cruel, it's necessary. Still, I couldn't shake the loneliness. Going no contact wasn't just about cutting ties with my mom. It felt like I was losing my entire family. Update 1. Update 1. A week after I sent the letter to my mom, the real drama began. My siblings, who had already been bombarding me with texts, escalated things by starting a group chat. It was all three of us, my sister, my brother, and me. The goal of the chat? To guilt-trip me into fixing things with mom. From the very first message, I could tell this wasn't going to end well. The first blow came from my brother. He threw out a line about how mom was refusing to host Christmas this year because of me. According to him, her exact words were, "There's no point in celebrating Christmas without Olivia." I didn't buy it, but it stung anyway. Christmas had always been a huge deal in our family, and hearing that it was supposedly ruined because of me was a gut punch. My sister followed up, trying to play mediator, saying we just needed to talk things out, and everything would go back to normal. But I knew better. There was no normal in this situation. As the messages rolled in, the comparison started. My brother chimed in about how they had both managed to deal with mom's personality all these years, and they were just fine. The implication was clear. They thought I was the problem. According to them, everyone has family drama, but not everyone cuts ties. I was being too dramatic, too selfish. It was the same old story, just coming from different mouths this time. Matt, my husband, had been watching all of this unfold. He suggested I ignore the group chat entirely, but I felt like I owed them some kind of explanation. So I sat down and drafted a long message. I poured out everything. How mom's manipulation had impacted me for years, the constant criticism, the emotional toll. I explained that going no contact wasn't something I did lightly, and it certainly wasn't just because of one argument. I hit send, hoping for some understanding. What I got was far from that. My sister, ever the peacekeeper, accused me of making things into a bigger deal than they were. My brother was even more blunt. He said I was being selfish and that the family was suffering because of me. He went on about how I should have just dealt with it like they had. The worst part came when he said that if I didn't make up with mom soon, he wouldn't be inviting my kids to any future family events. That was a low blow. My kids adore their cousins, and the thought of them being cut off from family because of this was devastating. I brought the whole mess up in my next therapy session. My therapist had been walking me through the emotional manipulation tactics my mom had used for years, and now she helped me see that my siblings were unknowingly continuing the cycle. It didn't make it hurt any less, but it helped me understand why they were acting the way they were. The situation took another turn when my grandparents got involved. My paternal grandparents, who I've always been close to, called me. They weren't aggressive, but the subtle pressure was there. They talked about how family should always come first and how life is too short to hold grudges. I could hear the disappointment in their voices, even though they tried to mask it. It was clear they wanted me to reconcile for the sake of family unity. If that wasn't enough, Mom took her grievances to Facebook. She posted one of those vague, passive-aggressive updates about how some people choose to walk away from family over petty disagreements. The post was flooded with likes and comments from extended family and family friends, all offering their sympathy. It was like watching my life unravel in real time, except I was the villain in everyone's eyes. That Facebook post hit me harder than I expected. The guilt crept back in. What if I had overreacted? What if I was the one causing all this pain? I knew, logically, that my decision to go no contact was the right one for me, but the weight of everyone's judgment was suffocating. Matt, as always, stepped in when things got out of control. He finally took my phone and sent a direct message to my siblings, telling them they needed to stop harassing me. He was firm but respectful, making it clear that this pressure wasn't helping anyone. He even suggested that maybe they should give me some space. His message was straightforward, and while I appreciated his support, I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The response from my siblings was immediate and loud, by going completely silent. They didn't respond to me or Matt. No more group chat messages, no calls, nothing. The silence felt like a wall being built between us, one brick at a time. I wondered if they were giving me the cold shoulder now, waiting for me to cave in first. Not long after, a family friend I've known since childhood reached out. She'd heard about the situation and wanted to talk. The conversation was all about how family is everything, and how sometimes you have to let things go for the sake of peace. It was like hearing the same lines repeated over and over, except this time it was coming from someone outside the immediate family. That's when it really hit me. This idea of keeping peace at all costs was so deeply ingrained in everyone around me. The pressure to reconcile wasn't just coming from my mom or siblings, it was the entire community. Meanwhile, my kids were starting to notice the shift. They asked why they hadn't seen their cousins lately. I didn't have a good answer for them. I didn't want to drag them into the middle of it, but I couldn't keep them in the dark forever. The whole situation was becoming more complicated by the day. Despite all of this, something shifted in me. Therapy was helping me see things more clearly. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about my mom. It was about breaking a toxic cycle that had been part of my life for as long as I could remember. I wasn't just standing up to her. I was standing up for myself, for my mental health, and for my family. As the days went on, I knew I had to stand firm in my decision. Even though the loneliness was growing, I couldn't go back to the way things were. But with the next family event on the horizon, I knew the fallout was far from over. Update 2. Christmas was fast approaching, and the usual holiday planning was well underway, except this year, I wasn't a part of it. My siblings had a new group chat going to coordinate the gathering at our mom's house. Not surprisingly, I wasn't included in it. Even though I had mentally prepared for this, being excluded still stung. It was as if I no longer existed in the family. They carried on with their usual plans, as though my absence didn't matter, which ironically, made me feel both hurt and relieved at the same time. My kids started noticing that something was different. They've always loved Christmas at grandma's, running around with their cousins, the big family dinners, and the usual chaos of the holidays. So, when they asked why we weren't going to grandma's house this year, I had to think fast. I told them we were doing something different this year, something special, just the 4 of us. But I could see the disappointment on their faces. They didn't understand why their cousins weren't part of this new plan. And honestly, explaining it without dragging them into the messy family drama was harder than I thought. Just as I was trying to keep things peaceful at home, I got a call from my aunt. She's one of those family members who likes to play the role of mediator, even when no one asked for it. Her tone was friendly enough at first, but it didn't take long for the real reason behind her call to come out. She said I was being stubborn and that Christmas was no time for grudges. According to her, all I had to do was apologize and everything could go back to normal. She didn't seem to grasp the fact that this wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about protecting myself and my kids from years of emotional manipulation. But of course, to her and most of the family, I was the one causing all the problems. That call from my aunt wasn't the worst of it. A few days later, I found out that my mom had been spreading stories around the family. She'd been telling everyone that I didn't care about family anymore, acting confused about why I'd cut contact. She played the victim perfectly, framing herself as the one who had been wronged, conveniently leaving out all the years of toxic behavior. It wasn't surprising, but hearing it still hit hard. Then came the ultimatum from one of my siblings. The message was clear: either make up with mom before Christmas, or they'd stop speaking to me entirely. I was devastated. The idea of being cut off from my siblings, as much as they frustrated me, felt like losing part of my identity. But I knew I couldn't go back. Apologizing or pretending everything was okay would only invite more of the same treatment I'd endured for years. So I stood my ground, even though it felt like the hardest decision I'd ever made. Matt, always the problem solver, tried to lighten the mood by suggesting we do something completely different for Christmas this year. He planned an alternative celebration, just the 4 of us, maybe a trip out of town. It sounded perfect, but the guilt crept in again. The thought of creating a new tradition without the extended family felt like I was abandoning something important, even though I knew, deep down, it was necessary. Things took another turn when my kids came home from school one day, upset. Apparently, their cousins had told them that we weren't going to grandma's because their mom is mean. It didn't take much to figure out where they'd heard that from. My siblings were clearly discussing the situation with their kids, and now it was trickling down to mine. It was infuriating, but I had to keep calm for the sake of my kids. I explained to them as simply as I could that sometimes adults need to take space from each other, and that this year we were focusing on spending Christmas together as a family. I brought all of this up in my next therapy session. I needed to vent about the pressure, the guilt, the constant feeling of being torn between my boundaries and my family's expectations. My therapist listened patiently and then reminded me that standing up for myself was an act of self-preservation, not selfishness. She helped me see that no matter how much my family tried to twist the narrative, I wasn't the one causing the problems. And then, as if things couldn't get more absurd, I found out that my mom had bought Christmas gifts for my kids, but instead of sending them to us, she planned to give them to my nieces and nephews. The reason? They shouldn't go to waste, she told one of my cousins. It was just another manipulative move to make me look like the bad guy. I couldn't even be surprised at this point. It was exactly the kind of thing she would do. As Christmas got closer, I felt more isolated from my family than ever. Even distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, started messaging me on Facebook, asking why I was causing drama during the holidays. Some tried to guilt trip me into making amends, while others just seemed confused. The constant messages only added to the loneliness, making me question whether I was doing the right thing. But every time I thought about backing down, I remembered all the reasons I'd gone no contact in the first place. Mom's holiday plans went public in her usual fashion, a long, cheerful Facebook post about how she was preparing for Christmas and how wonderful it was to be surrounded by family. It didn't take a genius to see that it was a dig at me. The comments were filled with sympathy and praise, making her look like the perfect, doting mother. I could feel the guilt creeping in again, but I had to remind myself that this was part of her game. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from an old friend. She had seen my mom's posts and reached out to tell me that she had gone through something similar with her own mother. She encouraged me to stick to my boundaries and not let the guilt break me. Hearing that from someone who truly understood what I was going through was a relief. My oldest child started asking more pointed questions about why we weren't close with grandma anymore. I could tell she was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a simple argument. I did my best to explain in a way that wouldn't make her feel torn between her love for her grandmother and the reality of the situation. As Christmas drew nearer, the tension in the air was palpable. Matt suggested I take a break from social media to avoid the constant reminders of the family drama. I knew he was right, but it felt like stepping away would make the isolation even worse. In the end, I decided to focus on our own Christmas, just the four of us. But even with the alternative plans in place, the emotional toll was growing. I dreaded what would happen next with my mom and siblings once the holidays were over. Update 3. Just after New Year's, I got a call from my brother. It wasn't the usual barrage of guilt-laden texts. This time it was different. He called to tell me that mom had been hospitalized. I wasn't prepared for that. In the moment, I couldn't figure out how to feel. Part of me was concerned because, despite everything, she was still my mom. But there was also that lingering resentment. After everything that had happened, could I really just drop everything and rush to her side? My brother didn't waste time before telling me I needed to come to the hospital. He was insistent, almost like this was my chance to make things right. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the pressure was more about family appearances than actual concern for my well-being. He kept repeating how serious things were, but I wasn't getting any real details about her condition. It was all just come now with an undertone of judgment for hesitating. I hung up the phone, unsure of what to do. Matt, as always, was my voice of reason. He reminded me that I didn't owe anyone immediate action, especially if it was going to harm my mental health. You're not responsible for fixing things just because she's sick, he said. And he was right. But the guilt was already starting to creep in, and I wasn't sure how long I could hold my ground. In my next therapy session, I brought it all up. Mom's hospitalization, the pressure from my brother, and the overwhelming sense that I was being forced into a situation I wasn't ready for. My therapist told me something that stuck with me: take time to reflect. You don't have to decide right away. Focus on what's best for you, not what your family expects. It was a much-needed reminder that I could still set boundaries, even in a crisis. Despite my hesitation, the messages from my siblings kept coming. Every few hours, my phone would light up with a new accusation. They were relentless, calling me heartless, selfish, saying that if something happened to mom, it would be my fault. The weight of their words felt heavier with each message. I wasn't being heartless. I was trying to protect myself, but they couldn't see that. Or maybe they just didn't want to. A few days later, I got an update from my sister. Mom's condition had stabilized, and the doctors expected her to recover. Hearing that should have been a relief, but instead, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, yes, but also guilt for not rushing to her side when they first called. Had I made the right choice by staying away? Would things have been different if I'd gone? The questions kept swirling, even though I knew the answer deep down. That's when my brother took things a step further. He sent a long, drawn-out message telling me that he no longer considered me part of the family. According to him, I had abandoned mom in her time of need, and there was no coming back from that. The words hit like a punch to the gut. It wasn't that I didn't expect this level of drama, it was that, despite everything, being officially cut off by one of my siblings hurt more than I was willing to admit. Shortly after, I got a message from mom herself. It was brief and cold, exactly what I'd come to expect from her. She said she was disappointed but not surprised that I hadn't visited her in the hospital. It was calculated, designed to push me deeper into guilt, and it worked. For a moment, I almost caved. But something stopped me. This was the same old manipulation, just wrapped in a different package. It was the same pattern she had always used to control me, twisting situations to make me feel like I was in the wrong, even when I wasn't. Word spread quickly through the family. Suddenly, I was getting messages from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, all saying the same thing: life is short, family is important, and I should forgive and forget. They didn't know the full story. They only knew the version mom had told them, where I was the villain and she was the victim. The constant pressure was too much. One night, after another round of family messages, I broke down. I told Matt I felt like I was being crushed under the weight of the family drama. He held me while I cried, reminding me that I had every right to protect myself, even if it meant upsetting the rest of the family. After talking it over with both Matt and my therapist, I started to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about mom being in the hospital. It was about the toxic patterns that had always been there. Her health scare had only brought those patterns back to the surface. The guilt, the manipulation, the pressure from my siblings, it was all part of the same game she had been playing for years. I wasn't going to let it pull me back in. A few days later, mom was discharged from the hospital. Despite all the earlier threats and accusations from my siblings, I didn't hear anything from them. It was like they had gone radio silent. For a moment, I wondered if they had finally given up on trying to pull me back into the fold. But then, out of the blue, I received a letter from mom. It wasn't a text or a phone call. It was an actual letter. In it, she apologized for some of the hurtful things she had said in the past. But of course, there was a catch. She also blamed me for being too sensitive and making a big deal out of nothing. It was classic mom, an apology that wasn't really an apology. It was just another manipulation attempt, wrapped in false sincerity. After reading the letter, I realized that nothing had changed. She hadn't taken any real accountability for her actions, and she never would. I couldn't let her back into my life on those terms. The only way forward was to stay strong and maintain the boundaries I had set, no matter how much it hurt. The tension with my family hadn't disappeared, and I wasn't sure what would happen next. But one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. Staying no contact with mom was the only way to protect myself, even if it meant enduring more of the family drama that was sure to come. Update 4. About a week after my mom was discharged from the hospital, I thought things had finally settled down. No more guilt-tripping texts, no calls from distant relatives. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But that calm was short-lived. One afternoon, there was a knock at my door, and when I opened it, I was greeted by my siblings. Both of them, my brother and sister, standing there with tense expressions. They hadn't called, hadn't texted, and definitely hadn't warned me they were coming. It didn't take long for me to realize what was happening. They weren't there for a friendly chat or to check on me after the holiday chaos. This was a full-on, unannounced intervention. They started by telling me how much I was hurting mom, how this no-contact situation was tearing the family apart. My sister, always the diplomat, went on about how mom was in pain because of me, that she couldn't understand why I was being so cruel. My brother, less tactful, laid it on thick, saying that I was the one responsible for all the family drama, and that I needed to fix this. It was clear they'd been planning this for a while, waiting for the perfect moment to ambush me. As I stood there, stunned, my first instinct was to lash out. But then I remembered my therapist's advice: stay calm, assert your boundaries. So I took a deep breath and tried to explain, once again, that this wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about protecting my mental health. I told them I understood their feelings, but that I needed space from mom, and this wasn't something I had done on a whim. But they weren't listening. Things escalated when my husband Matt overheard what was happening and came to stand by my side. He was calm but firm, telling my siblings that showing up like this wasn't the way to resolve anything. He politely but clearly asked them to leave. Instead of backing down, my brother accused Matt of brainwashing me into cutting off the family, while my sister chimed in, suggesting that my therapist was filling my head with nonsense. I could feel the tension rising, and it became clear that this wasn't about understanding my perspective. It was about forcing me to comply. At one point, my sister even broke down in tears, saying she just wanted the family to be together again. It was a powerful moment, and I felt sympathy for her. For a split second, I considered giving in just to make it all stop. But I knew that doing so would mean sacrificing everything I had worked for, all the boundaries I'd set to protect myself. So, I stood my ground. I can't sacrifice my mental health to keep up appearances, I told them. This isn't about hurting anyone, but I need space, and that's not going to change. My siblings didn't take that well. The tears turned to frustration, and the frustration turned to anger. They stormed out, slamming the door behind them. I was left standing there, shaken but proud of myself for not giving in to the pressure. Matt wrapped his arms around me and told me how proud he was, but I couldn't shake the fear that my relationship with my siblings might never recover from this. The aftermath was immediate. My siblings wasted no time telling the rest of the family about the failed intervention. Within hours, I was getting more messages, this time from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all telling me I was being unreasonable. The familiar refrain of family comes first echoed through every message, with a few people even saying that I should just make peace for the sake of the family. It was exhausting, and it felt like I was back at square one, fighting the same battle I'd been fighting for months. But this time, something was different. Instead of questioning myself, I doubled down. I knew that going back now would undo all the progress I'd made. The boundaries I had set were the only thing keeping me sane. As painful as it was, I couldn't afford to let guilt push me back into the toxic cycle I'd been trying to break free from. In my next therapy session, I laid everything out. My therapist helped me process the emotions I was feeling: anger, sadness, fear, and reminded me that family boundaries are valid, even when they're painful. She reinforced the idea that I wasn't being selfish. I was protecting myself. That reassurance gave me the strength I needed to keep moving forward. Interestingly, after the failed intervention, my mom went completely silent. No calls, no texts, Nothing. At first, I thought maybe she was waiting for me to crack, hoping the silence would make me reach out. But then I started to wonder if she was planning something more manipulative, something to make me feel even worse. It was always hard to tell with her, and the uncertainty left me on edge. Meanwhile, my kids started picking up on the tension again. They'd overheard bits of the conversation with my siblings and had more questions about why they didn't see grandma anymore. My oldest was starting to put the pieces together, and it was getting harder to keep things vague. I tried my best to explain that sometimes even adults need space from each other, but it was clear that they were confused and upset by the whole situation. Despite the emotional toll, something shifted in me after that intervention. For the first time, I felt empowered by my decision to stand firm. This wasn't just about keeping my mom at a distance, it was about reclaiming my life from years of emotional manipulation. I realized that by holding my ground, I was finally taking control of my own story, instead of letting my family write it for me. I know the family drama isn't over. I can feel it in the air, that anticipation of the next move from my mom or siblings. But for the first time in a long time, I feel secure in my decision. Whatever comes next, I'm ready for it.